Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 20 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on the living room of a house on the campus of a small New England college. It is 2 a.m. when George, a middle-aged history professor, and his wife Martha arrive home from a party, much the worse for wear from drink. To George's annoyance, Martha announces that she has invited another couple back for more after-party drinks. The young couple, who has newly arrived on campus, are a young, good-looking lecturer, Nick, and his somewhat sheepish wife, Honey. What follows is arguably the most extended and vitriolic marital argument ever staged. Over 4 hours of drunken skirmishing, George and Martha tear strips off each other and their young guests, in a terrifying mix of games playing and truth-telling, fueled by anger, shame, disappointment, hatred, and possibly even love. As the hostilities intensify, both couples are forced to face unvarnished and difficult truths about themselves and their relationships. Who are the survivors of this long night's journey? Or put another way, who's afraid of Virginia Woolf? For this is American playwright Edward Albee's classic play, with certainly one of the most memorable titles in theatrical history. The controversial play opened on Broadway in 1962, and it was greeted by both moral outrage, one reviewer labeling it a sick play for sick people, as well as critical acclaim, the most shattering drama since O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night. Both types of review contributed to its runaway box office success, the play running for 664 performances and famously attracting the interest of Hollywood, where in 1966 Warner Brothers released the film version with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor in the lead roles. The film went on to be nominated for 13 Academy Awards, winning 5. Controversy continued to follow the play, however. In 1963, it won the Tony Award for Best Play and was selected for the Pulitzer Prize by the award's drama journey. But they were overruled by the prize's advisory committee, who labeled it a filthy play and chose not to give a drama award at all that year. The play has nonetheless become a fixture of the dramatic canon, and was most recently seen in London's West End in 2017, in a production that won rave reviews, particularly for Imelda Staunton for her performance as Martha. The production was a wonderful reminder of the enduring, even shocking power of the play. It was not an easy watch. So, do we feel strong enough to tackle this blistering onslaught of a play? Well, joining me to survey the carnage of the marital battles are two of the most culturally erudite people I know, certainly among the most widely read, for they are John Mitchinson and Andy Miller, the founders and co-hosts of one of my and many book lovers' favorite podcasts, Backlisted. As the strapline for Backlisted goes, they give new life to old books, choosing to revisit titles and authors that are perhaps less well known than many that have endured in the popular or critical catalog. Backlisted has been running for more than 5 years, with over 125 episodes, and is beloved by many thousands of listeners because of the fascinating books that they rediscover, but also because of the wonderful warmth and wisdom of the two presenters, John and Andy. Welcome to you both.
You're so kind. Thank you.
Nice, Douglas.
Nothing more than the truth. I'm really delighted that you're here today. It feels a bit surreal. I'm so used to listening to you on Backlist. It feels like my podcast heroes have materialized in my front room. Well, not quite my front room, of course, because you're not in my front room, but down the line at least. I'm also happy to confess, actually, before we kick off, that Backlisted was a very specific inspiration for my launching the Play podcast. So thank you for that.
Oh, that's great to hear. How amazing. Thank you.
Well, you probably know as I've ripped off a lot of your format, but anyway, onward.
We didn't build it from original parts, so don't worry.
So it's not copyright.
We struggle really to defend it as a format. Let's be honest.
Fair enough. I will go further, actually. I owe it to you to both to give a brief introduction to your other accomplishments, as you do so graciously for your guests on Backlisted. So, John Mitchinson is a writer and publisher, a co-founder of Unbound, the crowdfunding publishing platform for books. He also helped create the BBC TV show QI and co-wrote the best-selling series of QI books, including The Book of General Ignorance, which has sold over 2 million copies. Before that, he held senior roles in publishing and was Waterstone's original marketing director. Andy Miller is a reader, editor, and author of books, most recently The Year of Reading Dangerously. He has also written books about how much he likes the Kinks and how much he dislikes sport. His work has appeared in numerous publications, including The Times, The Telegraph, The Guardian, The Spectator, and then there's a long list here, which I'm not going to read. He has toured the UK with his motivational lecture, Read Yourself Fitter, and appears regularly on BBC radio programs such as The Verb, The Museum of Curiosity, and Open Book. Amongst other things, he's been described as shit hot at reading. I love that one, Andy.
That's one of the nicer things that's been said about me.
Who described you thus?
It was somebody on Twitter, and it made me laugh so much. I couldn't even decode it. I couldn't work out if they wanted to hit me or hug me. But it really, really makes me laugh. So I've just incorporated it into my.
It's brilliant. I think you're very good at reading too.
It was worth coming. Thank you.
We're here today to talk not about a work of fiction, which is the usual choice of backlisted, but a play that John and Andy between them selected when I asked them, and they pestered them if they would join me on the podcast. So guys, what about theater and plays? In normal times, do you go to the theater a lot? Do you ever read plays? And of course, most pertinently, why did you choose this play? Andy, do you want to kick off?
We chose the play because we wanted something that we both liked and felt we could talk to you about with a degree of insight. And obviously, one of the things we like about Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is it's sort of what Backlisted is like behind the scenes. So the bonhomie that you hear on air, 5 minutes before we start, we're just really going at one another, right? So there's the autobiographical aspect of it.
It's personal experience.
Funnily enough, I read a lot of drama when I was a teenager and a young person, more than I read poetry. Certainly drama was my thing, and I did for a while think that might be a direction that I might go in, either as a performer or a writer. My career went in other directions, which is fine. I don't go to the theatre at normal times as much as I would like to, because although we have decent theatres near where I live, getting in and out of London is more complicated and timings are more difficult than I would like. And also, I don't know, John, how you feel about this. While it's easier to go to matinees, I support anyone who does go. I'm not down on him. I personally feel it's not quite the full 9 yards to go to the matinee. I think you want to come out in the dark, totally. Don't you? You want to come out at 10 to 10:30 at night and go for a drink. And
yeah, so that's a bit of a sore point for me, because I'm getting to that age where I almost prefer to go to the matinee. Certainly my wife, we also always have this when we come out of the Almeida in North London and think of our journey home at 11 o'clock at night or whatever, then we think, why don't we go to a matinee? However, I feel like it labels me as very old person, so I try not to do that. But what about Virginia Woolf, Andy? Why did you choose this between you guys?
Well, John, what's your take on it?
I tell you that there was actually quite a specific reason, because we had both watched a film called Shirley, about Shirley Jackson, which had a kind of it felt very familiar, because it was a young couple going into a house with an older academic couple who were kind of tearing each other strips off one another, but strangely also there was a kind of a bond of love between the couple, Shirley Jackson and her husband. And I think we both said we kind of liked the film, but we felt that it was...
You specifically said that your response was it. But why am I watching this when Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf already exists?
Yeah, and so briefly for me on theatre, I have not been going to the theatre for a long, long time. I mean, I've been watching movies. Like Andy, I think I was probably more drawn to theatre when I was a student. I directed plays. I wanted, at one point, was thinking about doing postgraduate research into Beckett. Drama was really, my mum's a drama teacher. It's been a very important part of my life. And it feels I sort of fell out of the habit. And I have to say, this year I've been reading more plays, and I just kind of baffled by my own lack of why I haven't been going. And I think when we get out of this long suspended sentence that we're in at the moment, that one of the things I'm definitely going to do is to go. I mean, I can't imagine anything, and I've not even suggested this to you, Andy, but I can't imagine more fun going to see a play with Andy and then going having a drink and afterwards. You know, it's just sort of civilized. I'm in my head though. Also, I'm trying to get round what would it have been like when the house lights came up back in 1962, and you had sat through this 3.5 hours of this play.
Well, we'll come to this as to what our reactions are. That's fascinating because actually, weirdly, I was really interested in a career in drama at some point. I got really inspired by a university professor of mine. His name was Ronald Bryden, and he was once the drama critic for The Observer here. And he came back to Canada late in his life, and his first class was this class in modern drama, which I took. And I was so inspired. And I landed in London, and I wanted to be a director and a playwright or whatever. And weirdly, through all of us, I think, our lives took another course, and we end up in bookselling at some point, which I don't know what is the refuge for all of us failed drama people. But
that's it, though, right? Yeah.
Those who can do, those who can't sell books about it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I'm proud of that, and it's a cult that we belong to.
Me too.
I like the books more than the public, but also I would say, like, John and I have both worked in different capacities in the book trade in different ways, you know, publisher, author. I maintain that I've never worked with a group of people who actually liked books and writing more than the booksellers I worked with in London in the mid-1990s.
I completely agree. Our earliest conversation about Backlisted, we agreed that what we wanted to try and recreate was the atmosphere of a Waterstone staff room in about 1992.
Yeah, you'd come off the shop floor and you'd spend your 20 minutes,
defending Faulkner.
Defending Faulkner or slagging off the customers.
This is very similar to my inspiration for the Play podcast, because I cite, in fact, on our website, that one of the things I wanted to just sort of continue and reproduce was the conversations that I had when I was working for Samuel French about plays. We did this in the kitchen, and all day long in our office, we talked about plays.
There it is. That's so interesting.
So before we get stuck into the play itself, and we could go on for hours about bookselling, apologies, listeners, but I wanted to give a little bit of breakdown to listeners about who Edward Albee was. So forgive me for a minute while I give a bit of the biographical detail here. He was born in 1928 in Washington, D.C., but his mother had been abandoned by his father, and so she surrendered her son for adoption at the age of 2 weeks. His adoptive family, the Albees, were a wealthy, childless couple living in a very large house with servants and ground staff and a chauffeur in Westchester County outside New York. The Albee family had, in fact, for several generations been theater owners and producers of vaudeville shows, but Albee did not come by his interest in theater from his family. Far from it, he always characterized his relationship with his adoptive parents as culturally chalk and cheese. He said that all of the family's traditional, personal, and social values ran completely counter to those that came to him naturally. He told a story about how in the family home there was an extensive library of leather-bound books, and one day he took a copy of a Turgenev novel off the shelf to read, which when his parents discovered, they chastised him for leaving a hole on the shelf. Yeah, the books were for show, not reading.
Wow.
So the picture he paints of his childhood is of a boy who finds himself living in the wrong tribe. Although his parents funded private school education for him, he was expelled several times because, as he put it, he didn't want to be there. And in 1946, at age 18, he left home for good, severing contact with his adoptive parents for the next 20 years of his life. In fact, he never saw his adoptive father again, and he did not attend his funeral when he died 15 years later. As he said, "I never knew him at all. I never felt comfortable with my adoptive parents. I didn't think they knew how to be parents, and I didn't know how to be a son. I had to get out of that stultifying, suffocating environment." So he moved to Greenwich Village in New York City, where he was energized to be living in a community populated with artists, writers, and composers. This was the 1950s, the era of abstract expressionism, and the so-called theater of the absurd, for example, represented by Beckett and Ionesco, which was challenging the theatrical orthodoxy. It was fertile soil for an aspiring artist. Albee's breakthrough play, The Zoo Story, was written in 3 weeks in 1959 and was first staged in Berlin before premiering off-Broadway in 1960. Having dabbled in writing in other forms, he said that he knew with absolute certainty and confidence that he was a playwright when The Zoo Story came to him so easily. In his lifetime, he wrote more than 30 plays, winning 3 Pulitzer Prizes for drama for A Delicate Balance, Seascape, and 3 Tall Women, and many, many other plays, including The American Dream, The Sandbox, and The Goat or Who is Sylvia, to name just a few. He himself cited Chekhov, Beckett, and even T.S. Eliot as influences on his writing, which displays elements of the existential vision of the latter two, as well as the nuanced portrayal of the personal tensions and disappointments that underlie family relationships that characterize Chekhov. Albee died in 2016, age 88. Obviously a very condensed biography, but there are a few themes in his work and this play that one might suggest stem from some of the events or circumstances of his life, which we'll come to in a bit more detail, including, for example, his interest in undermining this veneer of social civility of the sort that he grew up in, and more specifically in his focus on parenthood and children, which must owe something to his unhappy adoption. But first, I wanted to ask you guys about the title of this, his most famous play. What does this play have to do with Virginia Woolf, as booksellers tell us?
Okay, I'll give you my interpretation, because I knew you were going to ask us this, so I thought I'd better have an answer, and I have got a real answer, not a comedy one. I think the thing that I really love about Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is the way it marries hyper-articulacy with total savagery simultaneously. That intellectualism is debased or raised, depending on your point of view, to pure feral warfare. And in that context, I would interpret the title Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf as saying, you could come at me with your Virginia Woolf and I'll be ready for you, right? Your veneer of 30 years of garnered academic civilization will not protect you or deter me. Johnny, what do you think?
Well, I mean, the take, and I know that Albee said this, he saw a bit of graffiti which struck him simultaneously as being that it was based on Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf. That's the joke. And it's a kind of classic university campus intellectual joke. But the kind of genius of it, I think, is, as Andy's alluded to, is that it becomes a refrain through the play for the great themes in this play, which we'll doubtless talk about, the difference between, the tension between reality and illusion. It's introduced by Martha at the beginning of the play as a sort of, didn't you like that, honey? And it's used right at the very end of the play almost as a kind of a salve, a kind of a truce, I think, between the two main characters. So it's that brilliant thing that I think you can only do in drama, which is to take a repeated phrase, a kind of a snatch of song, and turn it into a really complex symbol for all the kind of things that are happening in the 3.5 hours of the play.
It's also just a magic phrase. It's just one of those, we don't really know why that phrase works, but so many people will know that of that phrase, even if they haven't seen the play. It's just got magic attached to it.
And that fear, perhaps, also, Virginia Woolf, famously kind of a forbidding novelist, that a lot of people don't feel that they're the usual thing is Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. A lot of people love to say, hey, it's me, I'm afraid of Virginia Woolf. I'm terrified of reading stuff outside my comfort zone.
You made a really great point, though, about the musical rhythm of it, so to speak, and the way it's used in drama, that you can repeat that. Albee said often that he was a big classical music fan, and he actually likened his playwriting and writing in the form he did to musical composition.
Yes.
So there are repeating rhythms that go on in the language, and obviously this is one of them. And it's a great story, as you say, about him. He apparently saw this phrase scribbled in soap on the mirror in the basement of a bar in New York. Now, I don't know what the graffiti artist had in mind by just scribbling this phrase, other than, as you guys have already alluded to, the daunting late novels of Virginia Woolf are pretty hard to approach. But as you're right, it is a shorthand also, Andy, for that sort of brittle academic world that they have a pretty good go at in the play. I wanted to say, before we dive in too much further now, and we usually give a summary of the play, if this is possible in this case, for listeners who aren't that familiar with it or haven't read it or seen it recently. And so I'm going to attempt to do that. I'm not going to give a blow-by-blow account of the battle, because that would take us 3 or 4 hours. So, as I described at the rise of the curtain, the hosts of the after-party party are George and Martha. Now, according to the initial stage directions, George is 46, thin, hair going gray. He's a history professor at a small New England university, at which, as it happens, his wife's father is president of the university. When Martha married George, he'd been earmarked to follow in his father-in-law's footsteps, but his career has been a disappointment both to himself and his wife. Martha is described in the text as a large, boisterous woman, 52, looking somewhat younger, ample, but not fleshy. To offset her disappointment in her husband and her life, she drinks and seeks sexual adventure outside the marriage, as they say, or as George puts it, musical beds is the faculty sport around here. So suffice to say as a premise that George and Martha are not happy, and their modus operandi is for Martha to carp away at George about what a pathetic failure he is, and for George to respond in kind about her disgusting vulgarities. They spend the whole of the evening of the play not only tearing into each other with increasing ferocity, but George also turns his bitterness to taunting and provoking Nick, the young all-American professor, and to mock and undermine his simpering wife, Honey, while Martha attempts to seduce Nick in front of George and his wife. There is a lot of drink taken, a great deal of drink taken, and the arguments and attacks become more and more unconstrained. The play all takes place in one night. It's in 3 acts, and in fact in the text each act is labeled, and the first one's called Fun and Games, which in a sense defines the structure of the play, because George and Martha are in the habit of playing games with each other. The game being, in essence, who can say the most hurtful thing to each other. And over the course of the play, the battle between them is a sequence of touch points in their relationship, which they open up and excavate, including by using Nick and Honey as substitutes for their targets. George even names the games which they play in sequence, starting with Humiliate the Host, with Martha doing her best to humiliate George in front of their guests, followed by Hump the Hostess, where Martha tries to seduce Nick, to which George counterattacks by going after Nick and Honey in what he calls Get the Guests, before the final round, Bringing Up Baby, which goes in a very dark and decisive direction, finishes the games, and concludes the party as the dawn breaks. So the intensity of the vitriol between all of them is breathtaking. It ratchets up and up as they get drunker and drunker, including moments of physical violence. The fury on display is dramatic and difficult to watch, but also psychologically so rich, and is beautifully written and controlled in arc and tone. Now, I haven't given away anything yet, really.
No, you've done really well.
Superb.
But what I wanted to start with was Albee, what you've heard so far. Albee, believe it or not, described this play as a sort of grotesque comedy. Would you describe this as a comedy, guys?
Yes. I've just written down and in capital letters on my notes and underlined the word funny. We need to quickly lob in the fact that it's very funny.
Yes.
But like Thomas Bernhardt, the Austrian novelist Thomas Bernhardt, you can be reading Bernhardt and you think, this is funny. This is really funny. And then 2 sentences later, you'll be thinking, is that funny? No, wait, this has got dark. When did it get dark? Get me back to the funny. And that is a thing I really love in writing. And it's really true of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, that you can be coasting along, listening to them. It's what starts as banter, I suppose you would call it, but then a terrible edge comes into it, and then half a minute later you're thinking, whoa, no, stop now, stop. And of course it doesn't stop. It's like really...
Yeah, total war.
So did you find it funny, John?
Yes, deeply funny, deeply disturbing. I absolutely... Funny you're going to mention it. Was one of the things I was going to make is I recently read Streetcar, Tennessee Williams, and that is a tragedy. That's clearly a tragedy. And this is clearly not. This is clearly a comedy. It's very difficult. But by the end of the play, unlike Streetcar, which I think is one of the bleakest endings of any work of art in the 20th century, I think one of the things I love about Albee, somehow at the end of this play, somehow it's dawn. Somehow Martha and George have got to a place that you didn't expect they would get to. I mean, let's be honest, it's not, nobody's going out singing into the aisles saying, it's barely a happy ending, but it ends in a place that is, I think, surprising and for me at least, deeply moving.
We can't give away the ending. We're going to get to the ending at the ending.
No, don't worry. So yes, it's a comedy.
It has an ending like 11 a.m. on November the 11th, 1918 was an ending. But
yeah, hostilities cease.
Yeah. The guns have stopped. That's very good. That's very good.
You're right, though. It is incredibly... I mean, I think, obviously, Albee's right. It is incredibly funny. The language is dazzling. The put-downs and the intelligence of their repartee is just astounding. And there's some great lines.
If you existed, I'd divorce you.
Yes, I swear if you existed, I'd divorce you. That's one of the better ones. But it is obviously, under it, it's also very dark, and we'll talk about that in more detail. I was also interested in the structure of the play because it feels on the surface like just a relentless argument, an exhausting and chaotic mess, really. So I wondered, you guys have been accustomed to assessing the architecture of writing. Do you see the hand of the author in shaping this play in any way, in some form, or something you can see the structure of? Tough question.
I think it's a very structured, very shaped play. I think, like a lot of great writing, you're so emotionally engaged and shocked and kind of and spat out at the end that you probably don't notice it. But going back and rereading it, I think, and we'll probably talk about the difference between the film and the book, but you can see that this tripartite structure is actually very well, the three acts, fun and games, Walpurgis Night in the middle, and then the exorcism at the end. He absolutely knows what he's doing. He's careful to, the characters have their moments together. Mm-hmm. George has his time with Nick. George has his time with Honey. And the only time you don't get two characters together for an extended period is Martha and Honey don't have a lot of time on stage together. Martha has her time obviously with George, but also with Nick. Albee says interesting things about the play and the film, but which I think we'll come on to that when we talk about it. But there's a definitely kind of symbolic quality to the play that comes out when you read it, and I wonder perhaps if you watch it that you don't get from the film. And Albee says that the film is such an emotional roller coaster that you perhaps don't see some of the other stuff that he's.
Andy, you have your hand up.
It's what we do on Backlisted when we want to, when we're ready to build on a thought.
That's good. It's good. It helps with multiple screens. Go for it.
Well, just to build on what John was saying, would you get that when you watch it? I can tell you from personal experience. So the first time I saw this was in the London revival in the 90s at the Almeida, which you mentioned, Douglas, earlier, where George and Martha were played by David Suchet and Diana Rigg. And I knew very little about the play. And my appreciation of the play has deepened significantly over the last 25 years. I found that I was really impressed by that initial viewing, but I'd had enough by the end. I mean, I'm not even joking. I found it a very intense and almost, I was probably slightly bored by the end. And yet, like with so many things, like a book that you read or a record that you play a few times before it clicks, things about it really stayed in my head, and I found myself thinking about it quite often and going back to it. And so maybe a couple years later I will have seen the film, and it was watching the film, it was the second viewing, having been blooded in the theatre. It was the second viewing via the film that made me think, whoa, no, I can see the patterns here much more clearly than I could the first time.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you talk about the structure, because actually, paradoxically, Albee apparently he claimed that he did no planning for the structure of his plays. And this is fascinating to me. His process was the opposite of the writer who maps out the entire plan in advance. He allowed the idea of the play to gestate in his mind. He made no notes, no outline or précis. His starting point was always the characters, and he would let them develop in his mind. He invented scenarios for them, he said, and tested them in these scenarios, inventing dialogue and their actions until he felt he knew them well enough that he could trust them to write the play. I let them have their heads to say and do what they want. He said that when he started writing, he has only a vague sense of their destination. So he believed artistic creativity came largely from the unconscious. But what this is extraordinary to me, when you see, you get a sense that there's this sort of relentless drive in the relationship of the characters. But you do also see, and particularly as you say, John, when you've read it, that there is this arc of structure, the games playing that goes on in sequence, and where they end up, it's very clear they're heading somewhere.
Yeah.
In some form of denouement. But it has, I guess one of the strengths it has is this propulsion that comes from this sort of feeling that this is all natural. It is heightened dialogue, as we've said, but we do really feel that this couple are playing out their relationship in real time. There's an organic drive to where these two characters are leading us in the play, which I guess comes from the fact that he knows these characters and are letting them lead him in this play. But I think that's an extraordinary process that he describes. I don't know how writers can often, I wonder, be disingenuous about their process. But what do you think about that approach?
I mean, I've read the brilliant interview in the Paris Review, which he is, I wouldn't exactly say he's disingenuous, although I noticed that the person interviewing was William Flanagan, who was his partner.
Mm-hmm.
They were known as the Sisters Grimm in Greenwich Village. They were kind of like incredibly serious, sort of clean cut, but kind of dour couple. But he is brilliantly tricky about, influences, about structure, about writing process in the way that sort of great writers tend to be. They're not going to give away what it is, because they don't. I always think if they fully understood the process, they probably wouldn't do it. He said he went upstairs every year for 6 months and came down with a play. That's how he kind of worked. And there's something, though, he says, which I think is really interesting when you're trying to approach this play, is that it comes across, and again, we'll get this from the film, it comes across as naturalistic.
Yes.
But he says, I think that if people were a little more aware of what actually is beneath the naturalistic overlay, they would be surprised to find how early the unnaturalistic base has been set. When you're dealing with a symbol in a realistic play, it is also a realistic fact. Going back to things like the ditty, the Virginia Woolf ditty, you must expect the audience's mind to work on both levels, symbolically and realistically. But we're trained so much in pure realistic theatre that it's difficult for us to handle things on two levels at the same time. And I think Andy was saying before about taking a view on this play. I think that is something you learn from multiple viewings and rereadings, that there's a lot going on in this play. As I said, the emotional hit is so hard the first time you see it. It takes you time to realise what Albee's the complexity of what it's a very complicated play working on a lot of different levels simultaneously, I think.
Well, I've got a thing here that I want to share with you both, which kind of feeds into what we've been talking about and also what Albee's trickiness. I'm going to read this to you, and then I just would like to get your reaction to it. So this is an interview with David Suchet, who's the actor I saw the first time I saw Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf at the Almeida. This is David Suchet talking about Albee coming to rehearsals, because I don't know whether you guys know, but Albee was very controlling with how things got cast and who he approved of and who he disapproved of. Edward came to rehearsals and confessed to me that he was angry and sad that he'd be remembered for this play and not all the others.
Whoa.
I don't know why I'm laughing. It's just so to the point, isn't it? He confessed he was angry and sad. Anyway, after watching our version, he told me, I never knew I wrote so much humour for George. I like it. Okay, so that's the first thing. That seems like a backhanded compliment to me. But anyway, Edward must have been the quietest writer I've ever seen in rehearsals. During the first few days, he hardly said a word, just watched us and then talked to Howard, the director. At one of the final run-throughs, he looked at me and said, David Suchet, I want a word with you. I thought, oh my gosh, what's this? He took me right to the far corner of the rehearsal room. Why are you playing George like that? He asked, not looking at me.
Oy, oy, oy.
I stammered the reasons. I said, I believe you've written a love story. However cruel George is being, he's trying to save his marriage. There was a huge pause, and he looked at me and said, that's what I wrote. And off he walked.
Yes. So this is bang on. Really interesting.
Brilliant.
So, well, my questions to you are: A, is that true? Is George doing his best to save his marriage? And B, was Albee being straight with David Suchet, or did he like that interpretation?
I think it's yes to both. Is my answer to both of them. So,
okay,
because what I was going to pick up on, John, as well, is I think the thing that's so impressive and gripping about the play is the layers that are underlying their relationship. This is not on the surface just a normal bickering, is it? It's one of the reasons the play is so absorbing is that underneath the bitterness of the fight, there's so many different things going on about the corrosion of their career, of the career disappointments, or their sexual disappointment potentially. I think there's very much a suggestion that Martha's unsatisfied with George in that department as well as others, and is humiliated by that, obviously, and unhappy about it.
For sure.
But there also, I am convinced there are vestiges of love in there, and there are some signals, there are some clues. So Martha talks about, for example, tells the story when they first met, and it's clear when she tells that story that she fell for him. And she says at one point, I'll make you sorry you made me want to marry you. He made her want to marry her. And then and later in the play she says, there is only one man in my life who has ever made me happy.
Yeah.
And that is George. And then she has a speech. And forgive me, on Backlisted you do these great things of reading a few extracts, and I'm going to indulge myself here because it answers the question, I think, to some degree. She has a speech, which I think is a moment of stunning, lucid self-awareness, where she explains to Nick something about the truth of their relationship. And it goes like this. George, who is good to me and whom I revile, who understands me and whom I push off, who can make me laugh and I choke it back in my throat, who can hold me at night so that it's warm, and whom I will bite so there's blood, who keeps learning the games we play as quickly as I can change the rules, who can make me happy and I do not wish to be happy. And yes, I do wish to be happy. George and Martha, sad, sad, sad. Whom I will not forgive for having come to rest, for having seen me and having said, yes, this will do, who has made the hideous, the hurting, the insulting mistake of loving me and must be punished for it. George and Martha, sad, sad, sad. Who tolerates, which is intolerable, who is kind, which is cruel, who understand, which is beyond comprehension. Some day, some night, some stupid liquor-ridden night, I will go too far, and I'll either break the man's back or push him off for good, which is what I deserve. Well, that is just tremendous, isn't it?
Yeah, fantastic.
Wow.
I mean, I'm not an actor, so I haven't done it justice, but the amount of self-loathing, the paradox of wanting but not allowing herself to let it happen or feel worthy of having love or happiness.
The layers of self-loathing.
You know, I watched the film again at the weekend, and the thing that struck me on this viewing is that one's interpretation of George, actually, especially at the moment, in the Me Too moment, is very interesting. is he trying to save his marriage? Well, we could call it that, but we could also call it he is far more manipulative. He's certainly the rainmaker in that relationship. He is the agent provocateur. She tends to react, and she'll escalate if she feels he wants to escalate. But when it comes down to it, he is the guy who makes the rain. And so that interpretation that Suchet is talking about there, you certainly could see it in that light, because he is more of the agent who generates the action, such as the action is within the drama. Our sympathies will be with her, and the speech you chose to read there is proof of that. The humanizing of that relationship comes via her.
That's a surprise, partly. I think it's more complicated than that, in the sense that the play flows back and forth a bit. So the first half of the play, Martha's on the attack, and she seems to be the one having a go. She humiliates him.
Yeah.
I mean, in no uncertain terms. She takes no prisoners, does him in front of these guests about his failure in his career and about losing a boxing match and how her father thinks he's not got the stuff, and all of that. Just lays it all out. But actually, of course, and he in a sense has no choice but is accustomed to this being hit and hit and hit. And he has a different way of hitting back, in a quieter way. But you're right. So the second half of the play, he just keeps delving deeper and deeper, putting the knife in further and further, and it comes harder and harder.
But Douglas, it's the rumble in the jungle.
Yeah. Rope-a-dope.
He's on the ropes because he wants to be on the ropes.
Yeah.
So he's taking punishment for a while because he set up the terms of that engagement. I might not have said this if you'd asked me a week ago, but that was my response to the viewing. A sign of a great play or a great film. It reads us, or we read it differently depending on where we are at any given moment.
Yeah. So John, how do you read this? Do you read about him being the agent, or also the love? What about their love?
Well, I think the love is real and it's palpable, and I think it lasts amazingly to the end of the play, and we perhaps can't talk in detail about that without giving too much away. But I think, going back to Andy's point and Suchet and Albee, I think he is a great playwright, and I think he is somebody who knows that in the end, what he's created is capable of multiple interpretations. Much as he may be a control freak, he knows that Martha and George are two hyper-intelligent people who love each other, but who, he says in the interview, that it's a very serious game that they're playing. And he says that the son, that is the sort of the thing, the donne that really winds the thing up to a level that perhaps it's not gone to before, obviously is symbolic, but that they're too intelligent, that in the end, that he said that the loss of that symbol, that's unified them, that's what makes the play. We think it's a comedy, it is a comedy, but it is also the tragic element is, he says, they're not deluded people, which is terrifying if you think about it, because in a way that's the whole point about Truth and Illusion. When she turns to Nick and says, you're only interested in surfaces.
Yeah.
And the deep emotional chasm between a young couple and an older couple who've been through the ringer is one of the things, again, looking in my late 50s, coming back. I mean, considering Albee was 30, he was 34, I think, when he wrote this, right?
Yes, exactly.
But also, do you not think that related to that, it's also about intellectualism as surface?
Yes.
The futility of intellectualism. I was thinking, they don't have children, and neither do the other couple in there with them. And her father is an offstage presence in the drama as well. So they're children. They're like these appalling, overeducated children trapped together, tearing chunks out of one another because the depth of feeling cannot be expressed. There's no emotional maturity to draw on. There's just this futile intellectual battering of one another, which goes back to Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. You bring Virginia Woolf to the party, it makes no difference to me. When it comes down to it, it's superficial. It's superficial intellectualism, childish intellectualism. I think that's a big, big part of it.
Before we leave the subject of love, and we're going to come on to the children, because this is opposite what you've just been saying, I wanted to just quote that Mike Nichols, the director of the film, observed that at the bottom of this relationship, he thinks it's about love. They suffer for each other because a definition of love is one partner wants the other partner to be his or her best self. George and Martha are suffering for each other. They love each other, which is how and why they're able to stand the whole thing. And Albee himself, as you've already, I think, alluded to, affirmed in an interview with Melvin Bragg on South Bank Show, he said, they have stayed together for 25 years because they love each other deeply, in spite of the things that have happened in their marriage. Now, okay, well, I think the point that we've all made is that this is up for debate, and that's one of the wonderful things about the play, is that you see glimpses of this, but it's a big question, and what is going on with them. Spoiler alert here, definitely. We can't avoid talking about the central shocking conceit of the play, which, John, you've sort of touched on, which is that George and Martha have created a fantasy between them that they actually have a son, which they do not. But you don't discover this until very late in the play, and they talk about their son in front of this couple. However, up until this point, they have kept that between themselves, and Martha has made the mistake of sharing their fantasy. She doesn't say it's a fantasy, but of saying to Honey, and therefore it comes out to Nick, that they have a son. And then tomorrow, from the night of the play, will be his 21st birthday. Now, a fascinating question about all this is, what is this all about? Why do they pretend to have a son? You know, some of the critics have criticized this central conceit of George and Martha, because as you just said, Andy, these are very intelligent, educated people. What is this fantasy all about? And apparently the screenwriters and producers of the film initially wanted to replace this with a real son who had hanged himself in a closet or something of that nature. What do you make of this invented son? And as we've just said, these intelligent people who sustain this fantasy.
Well, I'd just like to make the point that it took me till the third go-round or the third viewing of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf to work out that there might not actually be a son, and that. But I think that's okay. I'm being kind to myself. I think
that's fair enough. He's incredibly subtle about the way he does this.
The terms you've just presented it in, Douglas, actually, I'm not saying this to blame you in any way, but they actually detract from where the emotional momentum of the play stems from, which is the fact that you, the audience member, like their guests within the play, don't really know what's going on, don't really know what's true or what isn't. So actually, I can understand. I'm sympathetic to the idea that the producers of the film contemplated the idea of making something less ambiguous for the viewers to grab onto, because actually the psychodrama of it, which is literally what it is, rests on two people knowing the rules and no one else knowing the rules, either whether they're in the play or the audience. And so to answer your question, I don't know what you think, John. There is no son, but it's fine if you think there is.
Well, I guess I mean, there is no son, and again, it's trying to not give too much away. But I mean, George's function in the play, he kills the son. You know, that's
yes,
kind of that is the dramatic part of the final scene. And I guess that for me, you're right. It's not abundantly clear. Maybe the first time you see it. I think the first time, I think that the moment she goes upstairs in the film and comes down, and Honey says that the son, that already triggered in me. That sounds to me like it's a game. That sounds to me like she's crossing some kind of So either the son doesn't exist, or the son died in infancy, or it's something that's kept up between them in order for their marriage to work. I mean, I think he brilliantly does it so that you don't quite know until the very end, really, whether the son existed or not. I mean, I'm aware that for people who haven't read the play or seen it, that we're giving away more, maybe. But I mean, I don't think it. Look, it's a work of literature. Knowing the plot in the end is the least important bit. But it's how Albee has that. Why should an intelligent couple, articulate couple, want to create? What is it that drives them to create this elaborate fantasy and then to dismantle it? That's the sort of the emotional movement of the play, that the crisis that this play is about. If all plays in the end are about moments of crisis, that's what that George's decision that now is the time for this to stop.
Yeah, I think several points you made there that are spot on. It is so unsettling. I think you have some sense that this is a no-go area, of course, from very early on.
Yeah.
You don't know explicitly why. And as you suspect, something has gone wrong. But they're not. There are clues in there when you read the text and look back at it. But it's still, you don't know until very late on. And I think that's so beautifully done, that the way he withholds that. But of course, it is, I guess, all the more striking as a symbol of their emotional desperation, because they are otherwise intelligent and rational. It's an expression of emotional and psychological pain and mutual dependence.
Yeah.
It's not rational. And that's when you were alluding to earlier, John, I think about the depths of this play, about it being not just naturalistic. There are resonances that are going on, and this is one of them that makes you think this is mining some very profound psychological stuff here. I was also interested, of course, thinking about the fact that Albee was adopted and all those feelings he has about parenthood and children and things. And I mean, oh my God, is it complicated in this play?
Yeah, can I say on that, I think there's this, I don't know, you probably will have come across it, both of you, but a lot of people thought that this play was about 4 homosexuals. I mean, they thought that was what Albee was actually, Albee himself was gay. It seems to me to be a very odd way to approach it. And he's very funny in the way that he kind of bats that away and just says, well, it wasn't. And he says, I'm guessing that, Elizabeth Taylor and the actresses who've played Martha would be very surprised to discover that they were playing a gay man. But I think part of it was that it's hard for us to spool back to 1962 to see what an assault on traditional American family values this play was, on the sanctity of marriage. I mean, I still think it's a shocking play, but I think in its actual context at the time, it was hard for people to deal with. Here are 2 couples that didn't have children. And as you say, that seems to me probably very connected to his decision to leave his adopted family behind and go and reinvent himself in New York as a writer. So it's one of the things that gives this play its energy, I think, is Albee's disdain for people playing houses and the illusion. It's all about, again, puncturing those illusions, which George is so brilliant at, the way he builds up and then destroys both Nick and Honey.
But they're collateral damage, though, aren't they? If you follow the argument that he is trying to save the marriage, then he takes them both to bits. Again, in a kind of on the ropes way, takes quite a bit of punishment on the way there, because the prize is get to that armistice at the end.
You're right, Dandy. I had actually written down somewhere collateral damage about these characters.
Yeah.
Because the whole thing is about the 2 of them, and they're just fighting through them. But I think it's interesting about the time you said that it was set as well, and what one feels about having children or not then. Because I read somewhere, of course, a reminder that in this generation, it would have been unusual for a couple to choose not to have children, given the expectation that was what women were programmed to do. And interestingly, of course, Albee's parents were unable to have children and adopted. And the absence of children could even carry some stigma. It's not hard to imagine it as a source of embarrassment or shame. And you can feel that, I think, in Martha particularly, potentially, because if this is a role that you're supposed to be playing and you can't fulfill it properly, then, how do you feel about yourself, or how others feel about you? It's a sign of the failure of biology, or even maybe something in the couple's relationship, that you're unable to actually produce these children. I mean, this would be psychologically pretty profound, I think, for you.
They're all flops.
Yeah, exactly.
As Martha says, you're all flops.
We're running way past our time.
This is just like what we do on Backlisted.
Yes.
Well, it's also a bit like Virginia Woolf, just going on and on. But I wanted to again, sorry everybody, risk of spoilers, I wanted to ask you about the ending, because the question about the ending is, what is their future? What happens is that it's dawn. They've literally fought through the night, and they've reached the grey light of dawn, and Nick and Honey have gone home, and it's just George and Martha left. They're quiet, they're spent, The battle for the moment is over, and the question hanging is, what is their future? How do they go on? What would their future look like?
Well, the joke, obviously, it's not a very funny joke at the end of the play, but he does the "Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf" line, and she says, "I am, George." I always take that to be indeterminate. Has as it were, the ritual killing, the ritual sacrifice, the funeral rites that George has intoned for the fantasy of their dead child, is that an ending, or is it clearing the way for them maybe to be more honest? It's so. I mean, that's a great play, right? That if we knew the answer, what happens next? Did you say?
But I thought on this viewing, well, I guess the positive interpretation would be, if this moment of clarity is possible for them, then maybe they still have it within them to create further moments of clarity and maybe string them together into a different kind of relationship. But that seems to me wishing too much, really. And to answer your question, Douglas, I could see that this is a final moment of clarity, as a guttering of a candle almost.
Yeah.
This is it. And we don't get to see what happens next, fortunately.
As she says twice in that final scene, yes, no, yes, no.
And George, in trying to sort of console her, says, "It will be better, maybe." So
yeah,
he can't even guarantee it.
We'll send them out with a song in their heart, yeah.
Well, it kind of does. That last refrain of "Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf" haunting.
Albee said he didn't know what was going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. I really don't know, and I don't think it's my job to know, he said.
Exactly.
But what he did say, and is referencing the title, again, it comes full circle, was that his interpretation of the title was, "Who is afraid of a life without illusion?" So, as you've mentioned, I think, John, a few times, the question in the central of the play is all about what is truth and what is illusion. There are many things we're not sure about when they say what's going on. They tell stories, we're not sure whether they're truthful or not. There's the whole conceit about their fantasy son. But in the end, what Albee has said, of course, and what George does is he explodes the fantasy of the son and leaves them stripped, absolutely naked psychologically, to use his words, so that they are forced to face this reality unvarnished and without the crutches of the fantasies or whatever. So the question is, how will they deal with that? Now, Albee claims that it's better to be truthful, to live with this sort of truth, than in this illusory fantasy world.
He would say that,
Yes, he would. Look, it's harder, of course, but he was often compared to Eugene O'Neill, and he did cite O'Neill as an influence, and of course, Long Day's Journey into Night and The Iceman Cometh, particularly, where he thinks O'Neill tries to demonstrate that if you lose your dreams, then you're looking at psychological devastation. You need your dreams. Whereas Albee's saying, no. I think people have the responsibility to know they are kidding themselves. How people cheat themselves. That's my basic concern. Everybody plays games. The play is about people getting to the point where they can't any longer exist with a whole series of games, tricks, and false illusions, and them knocking them down. The end result, something may or may not be built in its place. So he's pretty unsparing about this vision, I think, but he also talked about his art is not pacification, it's disturbance. It's an attempt to change people's perceptions of themselves. So he wants us to question these things and to look more closely at ourselves, I guess, and the truth and realities. Pretty hard going, isn't it?
Yep. I mean, scorched earth, right? There's not much left. Not much left standing. There's not much room for hope at the end of the play, but a glimmer maybe.
Well, I think you see in the film, didn't you think? I thought they were very gentle with each other, and then there's definitely some potential to carry on in some form.
Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, what is the lesson? The lesson of the film, the lesson of the play is that those people make that dark energy that's bigger than two of them, and that energy is always going to need to find an out, especially if you're looking at 25 years of learned behavior. I mean, in a sense, the play is about capturing that relationship, that type of relationship, that release of energy. I'm almost surprised with this play that it's written down. It's so good that it seems incredible that someone wrote it. because it's a cliche, but it's lightning in a bottle or a storm in a bottle. And so in a sense, the idea of what happens next, well, this is going to happen again because they're acting out their roles within that relationship. And just to finish my thought, I hope they do. I hope it does happen again. I don't want them to be happy. I want them to crash and burn and let me watch them burning.
And there's this other kind of way of looking at the play, which Albee himself was slightly dismissive of, that it's Martha and George, Washington, the revolutionary idea of America and of a kind of a positivist view of American history, which he's kind of putting through the ringer in this play, and that political way of reading the play. I mean, a lot of people are always pointing out that Arthur Miller was a political playwright, Albee isn't, but I think what Albee's sort of doing is saying all of these constructs, human constructs, are all to some degree or other, including, America, are illusory. And, the job of an artist is to shine the brightest, harshest possible light on illusion and to see what's left when we take that away from people. And you're right, he's very critical that, basically, Iceman Cometh is drunks cheering themselves up. This is about drunks tearing down everything, and so there's nothing left standing, except they are standing, weirdly and oddly, and at the end of the play, they still, and as Andy says, round two, probably, who knows? It's hard to come away with this play being optimistic. But
John, I was going to refer to these questions about the politics, but I mean, this is all just sort of added richness to what is the central psychological thing of the play. But
yeah, I think so.
Albee has said that all his plays are political because the personal is political in the sense that individual values and behaviors multiplied equal our society or our politics writ large. And he has therefore saying that America in particular needed to recognize at this time, it was JFK was the president, and he and many others believed that change was possible, but he said we need to look honestly at ourselves. And he, as you said earlier, wanted certainly to rip the facade off the 50s idea of the American family, but it was also about the American dream.
Yeah.
I mean, Nick is very ambitious.
Eugenicist future.
Yeah, and about the self-interest of the conservative politics of the establishment he grew up in. He's not comfortable with that. So he has a go at a number of these things through the play, which we haven't touched on because so central to it is the personal relationship.
We haven't touched on, I'm aware, Douglas, that we haven't touched on this. There's a longest speech in the book is the story that George tells about the kid and in the gin mill and the ordering a Bergen and turning that into a story, and then it turns out that maybe that was a story that he turned into a novel, and maybe that novel wasn't a novel, maybe it was actually what happened to George.
Yeah, or maybe it wasn't.
Albee is saying that art is an illusion. This play that you were watching, do not forget that what this is, this is no more truth than anything. If the old definition of a great work of art is that, you get more from it on the sixth reading than you do on the first, then this is, I have to say, it's been such a pleasure to re-engage with it.
Just talking about it has been a total pleasure. We always, on Backlisted, we always enjoy the episodes where we find out what we think about a book during the recording.
Yes. Well, also, it's been hugely stimulating. I realized there's so much more we could talk about, but you know what? We've recorded about twice as much as we usually do. So we're going to have to draw it to a close here, I'm afraid. But before we do, as I forewarned you, one of the traditions of our podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend a play that we could talk about in future episodes. So do each of you have a personal favorite that you would be happy to nominate?
I'll go first because I read it over Christmas and I'd never read it before, and I sadly never saw it on stage in London when it was staged. It's Jerusalem by Jez Butterworth, and very briefly, it has a fantastic, multifaceted character at the centre, Johnny Rooster Byron, but it's also one of the best, funniest and most accurate and most tragic plays about English culture, particularly English rural culture. As I say, haven't seen it, but the experience of reading it, we were reading it because our son had decided he was going to do a piece from it for his auditions. and we had the most brilliant conversation about it. So, for all those personal reasons, but I will also, just as a brilliant bit of contemporary British drama, I think it's a masterpiece and reads beautifully as well as. And I think it's being put back on the stage at some point soon.
Yes, it's very high up on my list. It's a fantastic piece with one of the most powerful roles ever written in Rooster, and Mark Rylance, one of the legendary performances, which tantalizingly apparently was scheduled to be revived this coming year, and we'll see. That would be certainly one to look out for. Andy, what about yours?
So yes, I do have a suggestion. About 5 years ago, there was a revival in London of one of Sondheim musicals, Assassins. And, you know, you were talking about how the personal is political. I've got a political and a personal reason for recommending Assassins. So the political reason is, if you want to understand things that have been happening in the States in the last 5 to 10 years, so many aspects of how power is expressed, Assassins by John Wyburn and Stephen Sondheim is the show you need to see. I don't know if either of you guys have ever seen it, but it is it's a musical where all the assassins of US presidents, or those who have failed to assassinate US presidents, come together to frame their murders or attempted murders as inevitable byproducts of the American dream, hardwired into the Constitution, because of anyone can have a chance in America and a gun. Those two things together in a series of pastiches of musical. It is the most witty, challenging, high wire act. It shouldn't work. All the things I've just described to you, it sounds bizarre and wrong, and it's held together by the fact that, in his own words, Stephen Sondheim has never written a bad song. He says, I may have written songs you don't like, but I've never written a bad song. But also, the personal reason is that Assassins is the Miller family's #1 choice of soundtrack for to sing along to in the car.
That's great.
But I don't know, have you done any musicals?
I have not. We have not done a musical yet, but that sounds like a great choice, and very unlikely, but then a lot of musicals come from unlikely germs, and I think it sounds really provocative, the idea. Thank you both so much for your time today. It's been a joy to spend time with you and talk with you.
Oh, thank you.
As George and Martha take themselves wearily to bed in the grey light of dawn, what does another day in their lives promise? Can they survive in the aftermath of total war? Is a new start possible between them? An end to their anger, their cruelties, their disappointment, their self-abuse? Who knows? But perhaps with the acknowledgement of the honest truth between them, there may be the beginning of forgiveness and mercy, and thereby even some peace and kindness for themselves and each other. As we leave the theatre, perhaps we will also be compelled to consider for ourselves what illusions we are maintaining, that if we confront more honestly, we may live more truthfully, to be better, as Albee would have it. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.